Meetings with Remarkable Men. The Material Question. On the 8th of April, 1924, the day of the opening in New York of a branch of the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, a dinner in honor of Mr. Gurdjieff was arranged at one of the Russian restaurants there by his friends and by several pupils of the French branch. After dinner, most of those present went with Mr. Gurdjieff to the apartment of Mrs. R. on 49th Street. Here, over coffee served by the amiable hostess and liqueurs obtained somehow by Dr. B., conversation continued until breakfast of the following day. Mr. Gurdjieff spoke mostly through interpreters. Mr. Liliance and Madame Verzalovsky answering all kinds of questions that were put to him, chiefly of a philosophical character. During a brief interruption, while we were eating watermelon, which came from Buenos Aires, and was a great rarity at that time of year even in New York, Dr. B., the proprietor of a large fashionable sanatorium, who had the reputation of being a practical man, suddenly turned to Mr. Gurdjieff with the following question. Could you tell us, sir, what are the means by which your institute exists, and approximately what is its annual budget? To our surprise, Mr. Gurdjieff's answer to this question took the form of a long narrative. As this story revealed an unsuspected aspect of the struggle he carried on throughout his life, I have undertaken to reproduce it, in so far as possible, exactly as it was told that day. I consulted other pupils who, like myself, had listened to the story with such interest and attention that they remembered it in almost all its details, and I have verified my text by comparing it with the notes of Mr. F., the stenographer, who took down all Mr. Gurdjieff's talks and lectures in America, so that people who asked questions which had been asked before could simply read through what Mr. Gurdjieff had already said on these subjects and thus economize the time. Mr. Gurdjieff began as follows. The question you have put to me, esteemed doctor, has always interested a great many of the people who have become more or less acquainted with me, but until now, not finding it necessary to initiate anyone into this personal affair of mine, I have either not answered at all, or have turned it aside with a joke. Moreover, there have already sprung up about this subject all sorts of comical legends which clearly show the all-round idiocy of their inventors, and which are ever more and more embellished with new fantastic details as they circulate everywhere among parasites and idlers, no less idiotic, of both sexes. It is claimed, for example, that I receive money from some occult center in India, or that the Institute is maintained by a black magic organization, or supported by the legendary Georgian Prince Mukhransky, or that, among other things, I possess the secret of the philosopher's stone, and can make as much money as I wish by alchemical processes, or even, as many have recently said, that my funds are supplied by the Bolsheviks, and much else of the same sort. And in fact, even the people closest to me do not know to this day exactly from where the money came for the most colossal expenses I have borne for many years. I did not find it necessary to speak seriously about this question, that is, the material aspect of the existence of the Institute, because I had no illusions about the possibility of outside help and considered conversation on the subject simply a waste of time, or, as is said, a pouring from the empty into the void. But today, to this question, which has been asked me so often and has already wearied me more than enough, I wish to reply, for some reason or other, not entirely jokingly, but somewhat more sincerely. My wish to reply more sincerely today is, it seems to me, and I am almost certain, due to the fact that after having become by the will of fate, or rather through the stupidity of the power possessors in Russia, poor as a church mouse, I have ventured to come to this dollar-growing country, and here, breathing this air saturated with the vibrations of people who sow and reap dollars in a masterly fashion, I, like a thoroughbred hunting dog, am on the scent of certain and good game, and I will not let the opportunity escape me. As I am now sitting here among you people who are fattened on what is called dollar fat, and feel myself stimulated by the automatic absorption of these beneficent emanations, I intend by means of my reply, so to say, to shear some of you a little. Therefore, in the pleasant surroundings provided by a hostess of a hospitality so rare for the present day, I will take advantage of these fortunate circumstances to mobilize all the possibilities for the activity of my brain, as well as the capacities of my talking machine, and will reply to this question asked today in such a way that each of you should begin to suspect that my pocket is itself a fertile soil for the sowing of dollar seed, and that in sprouting there these dollars acquire the property of bringing the sowers what could be, in the objective sense, their real happiness in life. And so, my dear, for the time being, unconditionally respected dollar holders, even long before I began putting my ideas into practice by means of my institute, that is, when I was first thinking out the program from every angle, I had carefully considered the material aspect, which, although secondary, was nevertheless very important. As I then expected to meet many obstacles in my effort to introduce into life the psychological ideas upon which this establishment, extraordinary for the present day, would be based, I felt it necessary to be independent, at least in the material sense, the more so since experience had already shown me that wealthy people never become seriously enough interested in these questions to support a work of this kind, and that others, even with great interest and desire, cannot do much in this respect, as for such an enterprise a great deal of money is needed. That is why, if I wished to actualize in full what I had planned, it was necessary, before thinking of carrying out the psychological tasks, first of all to resolve this aspect of the problem. Therefore, with the aim of creating sufficient capital for this purpose within a set period, I began to devote much more time than before to earning money. What I've just said must in all probability arouse complete perplexity in most of you Americans, who at the present time everywhere on earth are considered excellent businessmen. You must be wondering how it was possible with such ease to turn these presumably large sums, and hence you must surely have received the impression of a certain sort of bragging on my part. Yes, indeed, this must even sound very strange to you. In order that you may understand, if only approximately, why and how I was able to do this, and where I acquired such self-assurance, it is first of all necessary for me to explain that before this period of my life, I had often been engaged in all sorts of commercial and financial undertakings, and was already considered by all who came in contact with me in this sphere a very astute businessman. And further, I must tell you something of my early upbringing, which, from my experienced point of view, corresponds most nearly to the ideal formed in me on the subject of education. Owing to this upbringing, I could then, and perhaps, if required, can still today, go one better than any businessman whatever, and perhaps even than you American businessmen. It is particularly appropriate to tell you certain details of my education, since we are gathered today to celebrate the opening of an institution which has as its fundamental aim the correct, harmonious education of man. The more so since this institution is based on experimental data accumulated over the course of many years and thoroughly verified by me. That very man who has sacrificed almost his whole personal life to the study of this vital question of education, so painful for the present day, and who, having been brought up by people with normally developed consciences, has been able to acquire the capacity, no matter what the circumstances, always to be impartial. The strongest intentional influence exerted upon me was that of my father, who understood education quite in his own way. I even intend at some time to write a book about all the direct and indirect methods of my father which ensued from his original views on education. As soon as there appeared in me the signs of a more or less correct comprehension, he began, among other things, to tell me all kinds of extraordinary tales, which always led to a series of stories about a certain lame carpenter named Mustafa, who knew how to do everything, and one day even made a flying armchair. By this means, and by other persistent procedures, my father fostered in me, along with the desire to be like this expert carpenter, the irresistible urge always to be making something new. All my childhood games, even the most ordinary ones, were enriched by my imagining that I was someone who did everything not as it is usually done, but in quite a special way. This tendency, as yet ill-defined, which my father inculcated in my nature from my earliest childhood in an indirect way, was later, in the first years of my youth, given a more definite form, because the ideas of my first teacher about education turned out to be, in certain respects, in keeping with it. And so, in addition to the fulfillment of my scholastic duties, I practiced various manual crafts and skills under his special instruction. The most characteristic educational procedure of my first teacher was that, as soon as he noticed that I was becoming familiar with any particular craft, and was beginning to like it, he immediately made me give it up and pass it on to another. As I understood much later, his aim was not that I should learn all sorts of crafts, but should develop in myself the ability to surmount the difficulties presented by any kind of new work. And indeed, from that time on, work of every kind had sense and interest for me, not in itself, but only in so far as I did not know it, and did not know how to do it. In short, owing to their original views on education, these two men, who consciously or even unconsciously, in the present case it does not matter, had taken upon themselves my preparation for responsible age, engendered in my nature a certain subjective property, which developed gradually as the years passed, and finally became fixed in the form of an urge frequently to change my occupation. As a result, I acquired, even if only automatically, abilities of both a theoretical and practical nature for carrying on various manual and commercial occupations. My comprehension also was gradually increased as my horizon widened in various fields of knowledge. I will even add that if I am recognized today in different countries as a representative of true knowledge in many fields of learning, I owe it in part to this early education of mine. Thanks to the resourcefulness, breadth, and view, and above all common sense, developed in me by correct education, I was able to grasp, from all the information I collected intentionally or accidentally in the subsequent course of my life, the very essence of each branch of learning, instead of being left with merely an accumulation of empty rubbish, which is the inevitable result among contemporary people of the general use of their famous educational method, called learning by heart. And so, at an early age, I was already well equipped and able to earn sufficient money to provide for my immediate needs. However, as I had come to be interested when still quite young in those abstract questions which lead to an understanding of the sense and aim of life, and gave all my time and attention to this, I did not direct my capacities for earning money towards the self-sufficing aim of existence on which, owing to abnormal education, all the conscious and instinctive strivings of contemporary people, and particularly of you Americans, are concentrated. I turned to earning money only from time to time, and only insofar as it was needed for my ordinary existence, and to enable me to accomplish whatever was necessary for attaining the aim I had set myself. Coming from a poor family and not being materially secure, I had to resort rather often to earning this indeed despicable and maleficent money for unavoidable needs. However, the process itself of earning money never took much of my time, because, owing to the resourcefulness and common sense developed in me by correct education, I was already, in all these life matters, what might be called an expert, cunning old blade. As a very characteristic illustration of my capabilities in this direction, I will relate an episode in my life when one day, just offhand, for a small wager, I opened a very original workshop. The details of this episode will perhaps somewhat lengthen my present recital. Nevertheless, I think that, thanks to this marvelous liqueur, marvelous, by the way, because it was not made in the usual conditions established on earth, but at sea on an old barge off the coast of America, it will not seem too long or boring to you. Well then, it was not long before the last big expedition through the Prieure region and India, organized by the society we had formed called the Community of Truth Seekers, of which I had been a member from the very beginning. About 2 years before the departure of this expedition, the members of the community decided to make their rallying point the town of Chateau in the Transcaspian region. All those intending to participate in the expedition were to meet there on the 2nd of January of the year 1900, and from there, first of all, to move up along the course of the river Amudarya. As quite a lot of time remained before this date, but not enough for a long journey, I, being then in Alexandropol on one of my customary short visits with my family, did not go far away as I usually did after spending the time I had reserved for them, but stayed on in the Caucasus, dividing my time between Alexandropol and Baku. I often went to Baku because there was a society there, composed mostly of Persians, who were studying ancient magic, of which I had been an associate member for a long time. The events which led to the episode which I intend to relate to you took place just in this town of Baku. One Sunday I went to the bazaar. I must confess that I have always had a weakness for walking round in eastern bazaars, and whenever I stayed in a place where there was a bazaar, I would invariably go there. I very much liked to rummage about in the odds and ends, where I always hoped to come across something unusual. That day I bought some old embroidery, and was on my way out of the rag fair when I saw a well-dressed but very sorrowful-looking young woman who had something to sell. I could see by everything about her that she was not a regular hawker, and was doubtless selling her wares from necessity. I went towards her and saw that she had an Edison phonograph for sale. The sad expression of the woman's eyes aroused pity in me, and although I had very little money, without taking time to think about it, I bought this useless machine with all its appurtenances. I carried this burden back to the caravanserai where I was living, opened the box, and found that it contained numerous rolls, most of which were damaged. Among those still intact, only some were recorded, the others were blank. I stayed in Baku several days longer. My resources were coming to an end, and I had to think about replenishing them. One overcast morning, I was sitting in bed, not yet dressed, pondering on how this was to be done, when I happened to glance at the phonograph. The idea of making use of it came into my head, and I at once drew up a plan of action. I liquidated all my affairs there, and that very day took the first boat leaving for the Transcaspian region. 5 days later, in the town of Krasnovodsk, I set my phonograph going to make money for me. It must be said that the phonograph was still unknown in this region, and it was the first time the local inhabitants had seen this marvel. As I've said, there were also some blank rolls with the phonograph. I quickly found a Tekken street musician, and got him to sing and play several of the favorite melodies of the local population. And on the remaining rolls, I myself recorded a series of piquant anecdotes in Turcoman. Then I attached 2 additional ear tubes to the 4 that were already on the machine. You may remember that the first Edison phonographs had ear tubes, and set off with it to the bazaar, where I opened my original booth. I charged a price of 5 kopecks an ear tube, and you will be able to imagine the result if I tell you that during the whole time I was there, all day long, and particularly on market days, there was scarcely a moment when an ear tube was free. At the end of each day, the amount collected in 5 kopeck pieces was probably not less than the profits of the biggest business in the town. After Krasnovodsk, I went to Kizil Arvat, and while there, I was invited several times to go with my machine to the houses of wealthy Turkomans in the neighboring villages. For these request performances, I received a considerable quantity of tiangi, and once even 2 very good Tekken carpets. When I had made a good pile again here, I took the train with the intention of continuing this business in the town of Ashgabat. But on the train, I met one of the members of our community with whom I made a wager, thanks to which this phonographical career of mine came to an end. The comrade I met was the inimitable and fearless Madame Vivitskaya, who always wore men's clothes. She had participated in all our perilous expeditions into the depths of Asia, Africa, and even Australia and its neighboring islands. She also was to participate in the coming expedition, and, having still a good many months free, had decided to go from Warsaw to Andijan to visit her sister, who was married to a representative of the textile firm of Poznansky, and to take a rest there before the date of our assembling at Chateau. On the way we talked a great deal, and among other things I told her about my recent enterprises. I do not remember how or for what reason a dispute arose between us, but the result was that it ended with a wager, according to which, under very precise conditions and by a definite date, I was to make a certain sum of money. This wager interested Vivitskaya so seriously that she not only decided to stay with me to see how I would fulfill it, but even undertook to help me. So instead of going to Andijan, she got off the train with me in Ashgabat. I must admit that the fulfillment of this accidentally arisen and complicated task, which I had taken upon myself, interested me so much that I was fired with a passionate obstinacy to carry it out, whatever the consequences, and even to surpass the set conditions. While still in the train, I thought out a general plan of action, and as a first step, I then and there drew up the following advertisement. The Universal Traveling Workshop, in its passage, will stop here for a very short time. Hurry and give your orders and bring everything you have to be repaired or remodeled. We repair sewing machines, typewriters, bicycles, gramophones, music boxes, electric, photographic, medical, and other apparatuses, clocks, all kinds of musical instruments, accordions, guitars, violins, tares, and so on. We repair locks and weapons of all sorts. We repair, remodel, upholster, and refinish any piece of furniture whatever, either in our workshop or at your own house. We repair, varnish, and tune upright and grand pianos and harmoniums. We install and repair electric lighting, bells, and telephones. We mend and recover umbrellas. We repair children's toys and dolls and rubber articles of all kinds. We wash, clean, and mend rugs, shawls, tapestries, furs, etc. We remove all kinds of stains. We restore pictures, porcelain, and all kinds of antiques. The workshop has a well-equipped galvanoplastic cabinet for gold plating, silver plating, nickel plating, bronzing, and oxidizing. Any article relined with white metal. Samovars relined and nickel-plated in 24 hours. Orders taken for all kinds of embroidery, cross-stitch, satin-stitch, chenille, with beads, feathers, plush, and so on. We stamp anything you wish on wood, leather, and cloth. The workshop takes orders for all kinds of alabaster and plaster models, such as statuettes, domestic and wild animals, fruits, etc., etc., and also makes plaster masks of the dead. We execute orders for artificial flowers in bread, wax, velvet, and colored paper, for wreaths, bouquets, ladies' hats, and ushers' buttonholes. We write by hand, print and decorate visiting cards, greeting and anniversary cards, and invitations. We take orders for corsets and trusses, and also make old ones into new. We make ladies' hats from the latest Paris fashions, etc., etc. As soon as we arrived in Ashgabat, I found lodgings and obtained permission from the police to print and distribute the advertisements. The next day I rented in the center of the town premises for the workshop, consisting of a large room opening onto the street for the shop, and 2 small rooms at the back. In addition, there was a small yard and a kind of shed. Having bought the most necessary tools and hastily set up a homemade Bunsen battery and adapted some old wash basins and vats for galvanoplastic work, I hung over the entrance a large sign with red letters on a white cloth, which said, "American Traveling Workshop, here for a very short time. Makes, alters, and repairs everything." The next day, when the advertisements were ready, I pasted a great many of them on the walls, with the help of a street urchin, and distributed the rest by hand, and then the fun began. From the very first day, a whole procession of Ashgabadians brought their things to be repaired. Lord, what on earth did they not bring? Much of what they brought I not only had never seen before, but had never even heard of. Indeed, there were the most unlikely things, such as an apparatus for plucking out gray hairs, a machine for stoning cherries for jam, a grinder for grinding copper sulfate to sprinkle on the sweat zones of the body, a special iron for ironing wigs, and so forth. In order to have a better picture of what went on there, you must be told, if only a little, about the local conditions. This part of the Trans-Caspian region, and the part of Turkestan adjoining it, had begun to be populated by foreigners only a few decades previously, and the new towns had grown up mostly on the outskirts of the old ones. Consequently, almost all the towns of this region were composed of 2 parts, the old, as it was called, Asiatic town, and alongside it the new Russian town, each living its own independent life. The population of these new towns consisted of Armenians, Jews, Georgians, Persians, and others, but chiefly of Russians, most of whom were public officials or retired soldiers who had finished their terms of service in this region. Thanks to the natural riches of the country, and the honesty of a local population as yet unspoiled by contemporary civilization, these newcomers quickly began to grow rich. But in the absence of any cultural influences on the part of the ignorant officials who had happened to become their governors, they remained just as uncultivated as they had been before they migrated there. And so, along with a flourishing commerce, which had brought them material wealth, there was nothing to develop any aspect of their intellectuality or their technical knowledge. European civilization, which was rapidly spreading everywhere else, had scarcely touched the people of these places, and the little they learned about it through newspapers and magazines reached them in a completely distorted form, owing to the fantastic exaggerations of journalists who in general, and particularly then in Russia, are quite incapable of even an approximate understanding of the real essence of what they are writing about. These newly rich people, according to the inherency of all upstarts, imitated everything cultured and fashionable, in the given case everything European, but drawing all their information about this culture and fashion only from Russian newspapers and magazines, compiled by persons themselves ignorant in these matters, they presented to an impartial observer a comical and at the same time sad caricature. And so, in great material prosperity, but without a single trace of even elementary culture, the inhabitants there were playing as children do at being civilized people. Nowhere was fashion more closely followed, everyone feeling obliged to be up to date in everything. Moreover, they eagerly bought or ordered by post from everywhere all sorts of new inventions, and everything considered appropriate to the life of the cultured gentleman, though of course only what they could find out about this from newspaper advertisements. Knowing this weakness of theirs, all the foreign tradesmen, especially the Germans, unloaded a mass of useless merchandise on them, or goods which quickly got spoiled or worn out. The comedy went so far that you could even find among the objects advertised a special machine for lighting ordinary matches. As most of the articles they sent for were either worthless to begin with or went to pieces almost at once, and as there was not a single repair shop in the locality, each family accumulated stacks of broken things. There was still another reason why there turned out to be so many things for repair. At that epoch in the East, and particularly in Asiatic Russia, it was the custom never to part with anything once acquired, and never to sell it, even if it were no longer needed or had fallen apart. Moreover, even if one had wished to sell, there would have been no one to buy, and besides this, the practice was firmly entrenched of keeping things in remembrance of something or of someone. So, in every house, the attics and sheds were filled with an amazing accumulation of useless things, which were even handed down from father to son. Consequently, when they learned that there was a workshop that repaired everything, they dragged to me devil knows what, in the hope of restoring and making use of things that had long lain useless, as, for example, grandfather's armchair and grandmother's spectacles, great-grandfather's balalaika, great-grandmother's watch, godfather's gift of a dressing case, the blanket under which the bishop slept when he stayed with them, an order of the star presented to father by the Shah of Persia, and so forth and so on. All these I repaired. Not once did I refuse anything or return it without repairing it. Even when I was offered too trifling a payment to justify the time spent on repairing some article or other, I nevertheless undertook to put it right, if the thing was new to me, since in that case I was interested not in the money itself, but in the difficulty presented by a kind of work that was as yet unfamiliar to me. In addition to spoiled and really useless things, they brought me quantities of brand new things, not damaged at all, which they were unable to use merely because they did not know how to make them work, owing to their ignorance and lack of any even elementary technical knowledge, in short, owing to their stupidity. At that time, the latest inventions, such as sewing machines, bicycles, typewriters, etc., were spreading everywhere at a furious rate. All these things were enthusiastically ordered and bought, but then, owing, as I've already said, to the lack of even the simplest technical knowledge, and in the absence of local workshops or specialists, as soon as the slightest thing went wrong with them, they were set aside as useless. I shall give you a few characteristic examples of this ignorance and naivety, which I admit I then made use of quite deliberately, without experiencing any remorse of conscience whatsoever. I remember how one day a rich, fat Armenian, puffing and bathed in perspiration, accompanied by his daughter, dragged in a sewing machine to be repaired, which he had bought for her trousseau, when he was staying at Nizhny Novgorod for the fair. At first this sewing machine was, as he said, a treasure. It simply could not be praised too highly. It sewed so cleanly and so quickly, but all of a sudden, for no rhyme or reason, and much to his vexation, it started going, as he expressed it, in reverse. Looking over the machine, I found it in perfectly good order. You may know that in certain sewing machines, alongside the lever regulating the seam, there is another lever for changing the direction of the feeder. And when this lever is shifted, one changes the direction in which the material moves. Obviously, someone had touched this lever unawares, and instead of the material being pushed forward, it was now being pulled backwards. I saw at once that to put the machine right, I had only to shift the lever into place, and I could have done this then and there. But seeing that I was dealing with a crafty old rogue, and learning from the conversation that he was a merchant of caracol skins, I felt sure, well knowing such types, that to cram his own pockets he had tricked more than one techie or Bukharian, who are as credulous as children, and I therefore decided to pay him back in his own coin. So I went into a long-winded story about what was wrong with his sewing machine, and told him that several pinions would have to be changed for the machine to work properly again, at the same time cursing by everything under the sun the rascally manufacturer of the day. In short, I skinned him for 12 rubles 50 kopecks, promising to put the machine right in 3 days. But of course he had scarcely reached the door when it was already put right, numbered and placed with the finished articles. I remember well how, on another occasion, an officer entered the workshop and said to me in a tone of great importance, "Go to the office of the regional commandant, and tell the clerk in charge that I order him." By the way, Russian officers of that period never spoke to anyone except to give orders. "To show you the typewriters. When you have looked at them, let me know what is wrong with them." And off he went as he had come. His offhand imperious tone astonished me and somehow infuriated me. So I decided to go there without fail, chiefly in order to find out what sort of a bird this officer was, and perhaps also to find a way of putting one over on him, which I must admit I always enjoyed doing, because, beneath an expression of naive innocence, I knew how to punish such insolent persons very venomously. I went the same day to that office, announced myself to the head clerk, and explained the reason of my visit. I discovered that it was the adjutant himself who had come to see me. While I was examining the typewriters, of which there were 3, the loquacious clerk, whom I had already made my friend thanks to a cigarette and a piquant anecdote of officer life, explained to me the following. These machines, recently received from St. Petersburg, at first worked excellently, but soon one, then another, and then the third got out of order, all in the same way. The ribbon stopped unwinding. The adjutant The quartermaster and others all tried to put them in order, but try as they might, no one succeeded. And for the last 3 days the office work had again to be written by hand. While the clerk was telling me all this, I had examined the typewriters and already knew what the trouble was. Some of you doubtless remember that formerly, in certain makes of typewriters, the ribbon spools were unwound by the pressure of a spring, placed in a special box in the lower part of the back of the machine, and were wound up by turning the box itself. As the ribbon moved slowly, the spring, being of considerable length, took quite a long time to run down, but from time to time it had to be wound up again. It was obvious that when the machines were delivered their springs had been fully wound up, and that, having run down in the course of time, they had only to be wound up again. But as there was no key or handle, it was difficult for people who had been given no instructions and lacked even the simplest technical notions to discover how to rewind the spools. Of course, I did not say anything of this to the clerks, but accepted their invitation to dine with them, and having eaten some good government cabbage soup and kasha, I went straight home on my antediluvian bicycle and what remained of its tires. That evening the adjutant came back to my workshop and in the same lofty tone asked, "Well, how about it? Have you found out yet why these brand-new typewriters won't work?" Long before this I had already become an old hand in the art of playing a role. So, assuming the expression called by real actors, respectful timidity and bashful deference, and employing special and pompous terms borrowed from various Russian technical works, I began to extol the perfections of this make of typewriter in every respect but one, in which, unfortunately, a change, though complicated and difficult to bring about, was absolutely necessary. As for the work to be done, I estimated that the charge would be almost a quarter of the cost of the machines themselves. The next day these perfectly good machines were solemnly brought to my workshop by almost a whole detachment of soldiers headed by the adjutant. I accepted them immediately, then announced in a very serious manner that in no case could these machines be ready in less than 10 days. The vexed adjutant begged me to finish them sooner if possible, as the work in the office was almost at a standstill. Finally, after much bargaining, I agreed to work at night and to deliver one machine in 2 days, but in return I begged him to be good enough to order his soldiers to bring the leavings of food from the mess for my 3 suckling pigs, which I had just bought and was keeping in my little yard. 2 days later one of these quite faultless machines was ready, and I promised the others for the end of the week. Besides the thanks and the 18 rubles I received for repairing each machine, the soldiers brought food daily to my suckling pigs, and took care of them themselves for the 3 months that I remained in Ashgabat, during which time my suckling pigs turned into full-grown porkers. Of course I explained to the clerks what had to be done when the springs ran down, but what my repairing had consisted of they apparently never understood. The same kind of thing was repeated many times in the town of Merv, where I transferred my workshop and went on with the same sort of work for 2 more months. One day the inspector of the local preparatory school there, I do not remember the name of the school, came to ask me to repair an electric machine for making experiments in physics. This was an ordinary electrostatic machine which, on the turning of discs, emits sparks, and which for some reason or other every school then, as it seems also even now, considered it its duty to possess. With this machine, in their famous so-called physics lessons, the teacher would pompously, and as though performing a sacred ritual, make instructive experiments, which consisted merely in turning the discs of the machine, and compelling the children one by one to touch the little metal knobs of the Leyden jars. The grimaces of pain appearing on the faces of the children on touching these knobs always provoked uproarious laughter, which these pedagogues considered as greatly assisting the digestion of food, and this was the usual finale of such a physics lesson. This inspector had ordered one of these machines, and had received it unassembled from the German firm of Seaman and Halsk in St. Petersburg. Although he and the other teachers, his colleagues, had assembled it according to the instructions, yet try as they might they could not obtain any sparks from it, and finally the inspector was compelled to apply to my workshop. I at once saw that everything was in good order, except that the two discs composing the principal part of the machine were not quite correctly placed in relation to each other. It was simply necessary to loosen the nut on the axle and slightly shift one of the discs, and this I could have done in a minute, but I obliged this esteemed pedagogue, who taught others what he himself did not know, to come back to the workshop 4 times while I was, as it were, repairing his machine, and to pay me 10 roubles 75 kopecks for supposedly charging the Leyden jars, which needed no charging. Such cases were of almost daily occurrence throughout the existence of this workshop of mine. Always meeting the poor halfway, I did not consider it a sin to profit by the stupidity of those who undeservedly, only by virtue of positions acquired by chance, had become the local intelligentsia, but who on the scale of real intelligence actually stood much lower than the general population under their authority. But the most original, and at the same time the most profitable affair, turned out to be the corset business. That season in Paris, the fashion in corsets had sharply changed. After having worn very high corsets, fashionable women suddenly had begun to wear quite low ones. This new caprice of fashion soon became known in this region through the fashion magazines, but the corsets themselves were not yet on sale there, owing to the remoteness of these places. Consequently, many women began to bring me their old corsets to see if it was possible somehow to make them into fashionable ones. And on account of this corset business, I found myself on Easy Street. This happened in the following way. Once I needed some whalebone for a certain stout Jewess's corset, which I had to shorten and incidentally widen owing to the progressively increasing waistline of the owner. After long and fruitless search, the assistant in a shop which, like so many others, did not have whalebone in stock, advised me to buy a whole out-of-date corset, since doubtless the proprietor would sell it at almost the price of the whalebone. I then went directly to the proprietor, but while I was bargaining with him, another plan ripened in my mind, and I bought from him not one corset as I had intended, but all that he had in his shop, 65 old-fashioned corsets at 20 kopecks apiece, instead of the usual price of 4 or 5 roubles, after which I hurried off to buy up corsets in all the other shops of Ashgabat, paying even lower prices because everyone was glad to get rid of their stock of these quite useless articles. I did not stop at this, but the next day sent off the father of the 2 boys I employed, an old Jew, with instructions to buy up old-fashioned corsets in all the towns along the Central Asiatic Railway, while I myself, with pliers and scissors, set about making fashionable corsets. This was done very simply. The line where the corset had to be cut was traced in pencil, more having to be cut from the top, and only a little from the lower part. Then along this line the ends of the whalebone were broken off with pliers, and the material cut with scissors. Then the girls who worked with me under the direction of Vitvitskaya ripped off the tapes binding the borders, cut them and sewed them on again around the shortened corset. All that remained to be done was to thread through half of the old laces, and a mignon corset of the latest Paris fashion was ready for sale, and as many as 100 were made in a day. The most comical result was that the shop owners, having learned of the metamorphosis of their old corsets, were obliged, in view of the great demand for them, to buy them back from me, with, as is said, gnashing of teeth. But now, not for 10 or 20 kopecks, but at the price of 3.5 rubles a corset. In order to give you an idea of the outcome of all this, I need only say that I bought up and sold in the towns of Krasnovodsk, Kizil Arvat, Ashgabat, Merv, Chardzu, Bukhara, Samarkand, and Tashkent more than 6,000 corsets. A material profit out of all proportion to the scale of the enterprise was achieved not merely owing to the ignorance and naivety of the local, so to say, variegated inhabitants, or even to my well-developed astuteness and resourceful adaptability to all kinds of situations, but chiefly owing to my merciless attitude towards those weaknesses present in me as in everyone, which, through repetition, form in man what is called laziness. It is interesting to note that during that period a change in the functioning of my common presence took place, inexplicable from the standpoint of ordinary science, and repeated more than once in the course of my life. This was a change in the regulation of the tempo of the incoming and outgoing of energy, which enabled me to sleep scarcely at all for several weeks, and even for months, yet at the same time to manifest an activity which, far from being reduced, was on the contrary even more intense than usual. The last time this state reappeared, I was so interested in this phenomenon that it became for me, that is, for my self-cognizing parts, a question of equal significance to that of certain other questions which had arisen in me long before, and the solution of which had, from then on, been the aim and sense of my life. I even intend, after arranging matters connected with the fundamental program of the Institute, and when I shall again have the possibility of devoting half my time to my subjective interests, to give first place to the elucidation of this question. This as yet incomprehensible particularity of the general functioning of my organism may be seen very clearly in the situation which existed during the period I am describing. All day long, an almost constant stream of customers, outdoing one another in loquacity, brought me their broken things for repair, or came to pick up those already repaired, so that the greater part of my day was spent in receiving and returning orders. The intervals when there happened to be no customers gave barely enough time, even when I made exceptional haste, for going to buy new parts and the many and varied materials constantly required. Thus the work itself had to be done at night. During the entire period of existence of the workshop, I had to divide my time in this way: the day for customers, and the whole night for working. I must say that I was greatly helped in all this work by Vitvitskaya, who very soon became almost an expert at covering umbrellas, at remodeling corsets and ladies' hats, and especially at making artificial flowers. I was also helped by the 2 boys I had taken on at the very beginning, the sons of the old Jew. The elder cleaned and prepared the metal things for galvanizing and polished them afterwards, and the younger ran errands and kindled the fire in the forge and kept the bellows going. Towards the end I was also helped, and by no means badly, by 6 young girls from local patriarchal families whose parents, desiring them to have a complete education, sent them to my universal workshop to perfect themselves in fine needlework. Even at the beginning, when there were only 4 of us, the quantity of work done was indeed such that it gave the impression that behind the door leading to the back rooms, on which of course there was a notice, entrance strictly forbidden to the public, at least several dozen expert craftsmen were working. The workshop was open in Ashgabat 3.5 months, and during that time I made 50,000 rubles. Do you know what such a sum then meant? For comparison, one must remember that at that time the salary of the average Russian public official was 33 rubles 33 kopecks a month, and that with this sum not a single man, but one who had a family and even a crowd of children, contrived to live. The salary of a high-ranking officer from 45 to 50 rubles was considered a great deal of money, and the dream of every young man was to earn this much. Meat then cost 6 kopecks a pound, bread 2 or 3 kopecks, good grapes 2 kopecks, and there were 100 kopecks in a ruble. 50,000 rubles, that was considered a real fortune. During the existence of the workshop there were frequent opportunities for making greater profits by going into enterprises on the side, but one of the conditions of the wager was that the money was to be earned only by manual skills, and by such small commercial transactions as would necessarily be connected with them. So I did not once yield to this temptation. The wager had long been won while still in Ashgabat, and the agreed amount earned 4 times over. Nevertheless, as I have said, I decided to go on with the same sort of work in another town. Almost everything had been liquidated. Vitvitskaya had gone to her sister's, and I was getting ready to leave 3 days later for Merv. What I have already told you is, I think, sufficient for you to have some idea of what I wish to make clear by this story, namely, that specific feature of the common psyche of man, which is ideal for you Americans and which you call the commercial fiber, may also exist, and be even more highly developed, along with other fibers which you Americans do not have, among people living on other continents. Nevertheless, to illustrate this further and to give a further picture of my activities in those days, I will tell you about one more commercial trick which I played just before I left Ashgabat. I must tell you that just after I opened my workshop, I announced that I would buy all sorts of things. I did so for 2 reasons. Firstly, I counted on finding parts needed for my repairs, as I had soon bought up in the shops and bazaars everything that could be of use to me for this purpose. And secondly, I hoped that among the old things brought in, or offered for inspection at home, I might, as often happened, chance upon something rare and valuable. In a word, I was also an antique dealer. A few days before my departure, I met at the bazaar a Georgian, whom I had known before near Tiflis, where he had run the buffet at one of the stations of the Transcaucasian Railway. He was now a contractor for army provisions, and he offered to sell me several old iron beds, of which he had a surplus. I went to his house that same evening, and we went down into the cellar to look at the beds, but there was such an intolerable stench that it was almost impossible to stay there. Hastily examining the beds, I fled as quickly as possible, and began negotiations only after we reached the street. I learned then that the stench in the cellar came from herrings that were stored there, 20 barrels of them, which he had bought at Astrakhan for the local officers' mess. When the first 2 barrels were delivered and opened, the herrings were found to have gone bad and were rejected. The Georgian, fearing to lose his reputation, did not wish to offer them anywhere else, so he took them back and placed them temporarily in his cellar, and then almost forgot about them. It was only now, after 3 months, when his whole house reeked of them, that he had made up his mind to get rid of them as soon as possible. What vexed him was not only that he had lost money on them, but that in addition he would even have to pay to have them carted to the dump heap, as otherwise the sanitary commission might hear about it and fine him. While he was telling me all this, my thoughts began to work, according to the habit formed in me during this period, and I asked myself whether it might not be possible, by some combination or other, to derive profit even from this affair. I began to calculate. He has 20 barrels of rotten herrings which must be thrown away. But the barrels themselves are worth at least a rouble apiece. If only I could get them emptied for nothing. Otherwise, carting them away would cost almost as much as they are worth. Then suddenly it dawned on me that surely herrings, especially rotten ones, would make good manure. And I thought that a gardener, in order to get such good manure for nothing, would surely agree in return to fetch the barrels, empty them, rinse them out, and bring them to me at my workshop. After smoking them, I would be able to sell them at once, as barrels were in great demand, and in this way, in half an hour, I should make 20 roubles. And nobody would lose anything, but on the contrary, everybody would gain by this. Even the Georgian who had lost on the merchandise, but would now at least save the expense of carting. Having thus thought things out, I said to the Georgian, "If you will take a little more off the beds, I will arrange for these barrels to be carried away without any cost to you." He agreed, and I promised to rid him of this source of infection the next morning. I paid for the beds, loaded them on my cart, and also took along one of the unopened barrels of herrings to show to a gardener. Back at the workshop we unloaded and put everything into the shed. Just at that time the old Jew, the father of the boys who were working for me, came in, as he usually did in the evenings, to have a chat with his sons, and sometimes even to help with their work. I sat down in my little yard to smoke, and the thought suddenly entered my head to try the herrings on my pigs. Perhaps they might eat them. Without explaining anything to the old man, I asked him to help me open the barrel. When the lid was raised, the old Jew bent over to inhale the odor, and immediately his face lit up, and he exclaimed, "Now that's what I call herrings. Herrings like these I have not seen for a long time. Indeed, not since I got into this damned country." I was puzzled. Having lived mostly in Asia, where they do not eat herrings, I could never tell good from bad, even if I did happen to eat them. They all had the same nasty smell for me. So I was bound to give some credence to this emphatic announcement of the old Jew. The more so since formerly, when he lived in Russia in the town of Rostov, he had had a butcher shop where he also used to sell fish. However, I was still not entirely convinced, and asked him whether he might not be mistaken. But he, offended to the core, replied, "What's that you're saying? These are genuine, preserved, such-and-such herrings." I do not remember what he called them. Still having some doubts, I told him that I had by chance bought up a whole consignment of these herrings, and that among us it was a good omen when any goods were opened, if some were sold at once. It was a sign that the entire sale would be successful. So now we should at once, without waiting till morning, sell at least a few herrings, and I asked him to try to do this immediately. In this way I wanted to make sure that what the old man had said was true, and to act accordingly. Near my workshop lived many Jews, most of them tradespeople. As it was evening, most of the shops were closed, but just opposite the workshop lived a watchmaker, a certain freedman. He was called on first, and he instantly bought a whole dozen, paying, without any bargaining, 15 kopecks a pair. The next buyer was the proprietor of the pharmacy on the corner, who at once bought 50. From the delighted tone of these buyers, I knew that the old man was right. The next morning at daybreak I hired carts and brought over to my place all the barrels except the 2 already opened, which were really quite spoiled, and from which had come that terrible stench. These I immediately sent off to the town dump. The remaining 18 barrels of herrings turned out to be not only good, but of the very best quality. Evidently neither the buyer for the officers' mess nor the Georgian merchant, a native of Tiflis, where they do not eat herrings, knew any more about them than I did, that is, nothing at all, and from their peculiar smell they had considered them spoiled, and the Georgian had resigned himself to the loss. In 3 days, with the help of the old Jew, to whom I paid half a kopeck per herring, which made him extremely happy, all the herrings were sold, wholesale and retail. By this time I had liquidated all my affairs, and on the eve of my departure I invited that Georgian, with many other acquaintances, to a farewell supper. At table I related how well this affair had turned out for me, and pulling the money out of my pocket, I offered to share my profits with him. But the Georgian, holding to a commercial principle firmly established among the old inhabitants of Transcaucasia and the Transcaspian region, refused to accept the money. He said that, when he had let me have the goods, he was certain they were quite worthless, and if it had proved otherwise, it was a stroke of good luck for me and of bad luck for him, and therefore he considered it unfair to take advantage of my kindness. Moreover, the next day when I left for Merv, I found among my things in the carriage a goatskin of wine from this Georgian. After the episode of this peculiar workshop of mine, several years passed, in which, while working unceasingly to prepare all the conditions necessary for the accomplishment of the fundamental aim of my life, I had to occupy myself quite often with all kinds of money-making affairs. Although the many adventures and unexpected happenings of these years might be of interest to you from both the psychological and the practical points of view, yet, not wishing to digress from the question raised this evening, I will not speak of them now, the more so since I intend to write an entire book about these years and similar periods of my life. I will only say that by the time I set myself the task of creating a definite amount of capital, I had already acquired much experience and self-confidence, and therefore when I directed all my faculties toward making money for this purpose, then, even though this aspect of human striving in itself had never been of interest to me, I carried it out in such a way that the results might have aroused the envy of even your best American dollar business experts. I engaged in the most various enterprises, sometimes very big ones. For instance, I carried out private and government contracts for the supply and construction of railways and roads. I opened a number of stores, restaurants, and cinemas, and sold them when I got them going well. I organized various rural enterprises and the driving of cattle into Russia from several countries, chiefly from Kashgar. I participated in oil wells and fisheries, and sometimes I carried on several of these enterprises simultaneously. But the business I preferred above all others, which never required my specially devoting to it any definite time, or needed any fixed place of residence, and which moreover was very profitable, was the trade in carpets and antiques of all kinds. Finally, after 4 or 5 years of, so to say, feverish activity, I liquidated all my affairs, and when near the end of the year 1913, I went to Moscow to begin to actualize in practice what I had taken upon myself as a sacred task. I had amassed the sum of 1,000,000 rubles, and had acquired in addition 2 invaluable collections, one of old and rare carpets and the other of porcelain, and what is called Chinese cloisonné. It seemed then that with such a capital I would not have to think any more about financial matters, and would be free to put into practice the ideas which had already taken definite form in my consciousness, and upon which my institute would be based. Namely, I wished to create around myself conditions in which a man would be continually reminded of the sense and aim of his existence, by an unavoidable friction between his conscience and the automatic manifestations of his nature. That was about a year before the World War. In Moscow, and a little later in St. Petersburg, I arranged a series of lectures which attracted a number of intellectuals and men of science, and the circle of people interested in my ideas soon began to grow. Following my general plan, I then took steps towards the creation of an institute. Little by little, I began to prepare everything required for the accomplishment of my project. Among other things, I purchased an estate, ordered from different European countries whatever could not be obtained in Russia, and bought instruments and other necessary equipment. I even began to arrange for the publication of my own newspaper. In the thick of this work of organization, the war broke out, and I had to suspend everything, though in the hope of resuming as soon as the political situation became more settled. By this time, half the capital I had collected had already been spent on the preparatory organization. The war continued to gain ground, and as hope of an early peace grew fainter and fainter, I was compelled to leave Moscow and go to the Caucasus to await the end of hostilities. In spite of the fact that political events filled everyone's mind, interest in my work continued to grow in certain circles of society. People really interested in my ideas began to collect at Essentuki, where I was then settled. They came not only from the immediate neighborhood, but from St. Petersburg and Moscow, and little by little circumstances obliged me to form an organization there, without waiting for the return to Moscow. But here, too, events took on such a turn that it became a problem, not only to work, but even to survive, no one ever knowing what the morrow will bring. The district of the mineral waters, where we had been living, became a center of civil war, and we found ourselves literally between two fires. Towns passed from hand to hand, one day to the Bolsheviks, the next day to the Cossacks, and the day after to the White Army or to some newly formed party. Sometimes, on getting up in the morning, we would not know under which government we were that day, and only on going out into the streets would discover what politics had to be professed. For me personally, of all that I went through in Russia, this was the period of most intense nervous strain. All the time, I not only had to think and worry about obtaining the most immediate necessities of life, which had become almost unprocurable, but I was also constantly concerned about the lives of the 100 or so people who were in my care. What made me most anxious was the situation of about 20 of my pupils, as they began to call themselves, who were of military age. Young and even middle-aged men were being conscripted every day, one day by the Bolsheviks, the next day by the Whites, the day after by some other faction. This constant tension could not be endured any longer. Cost what it might, some way out had to be found. One night, when there was more shooting than usual, and echoes of the anxious conversations of my companions reached me from the adjoining rooms, I began to reflect very seriously. While I was considering ways out of the impasse, I remembered by association one of the sayings of the wise Mullah Nasruddin, which long before this had become for me a sort of fixed idea, namely, in every circumstance of life, always strive to combine the useful with the agreeable. I should mention here that for many years
I had been interested in an archaeological question, and in order to clarify certain details, I needed to find out as much as possible about the situation and pattern of arrangement of those monuments called dolmens, which have survived from very ancient times and can be found in our day in certain specific locations on almost every continent. I had definite information that such dolmens were to be found in many places in the Caucasus, and even knew the approximate location of some of them as indicated by official science. Although I had never had enough time for a systematic exploration of these places, nevertheless, during my frequent trips through the mountains of the Caucasus and Transcaucasia, I had never missed an opportunity for going to see them, choosing for this the times least detrimental to the pursuit of my fundamental aim. As a result of what I had already discovered myself, it had become quite clear to me that in the regions between the eastern shores of the Black Sea and the chain of the Caucasus Mountains, especially in the neighborhood of certain passes I had not yet been over, dolmens were to be found, standing singly and also in little groups, of a particular type which would be of great interest to me. So as I found myself cut off from the world, with my activities brought to a standstill by the situation which had arisen, I decided to use the time at my disposal for a special expedition to those regions of the Caucasus, in order to search for and examine these dolmens, and at the same time bring both myself and the people in my care into safety. The next morning I marshaled all my resources, and with the help of several persons who were more or less half-consciously or unconsciously devoted to me, and who had some kind of relationship with the various power possessors of that moment, I set about trying to procure official permission for organizing a scientific expedition into the Caucasus Mountains. Having succeeded in getting this permission, I obtained by all sorts of devices everything necessary for a journey of this kind. I then chose a number of my pupils, chiefly those for whom it was most dangerous to stay in the district of the mineral waters. After I had provided for the others remaining behind, we set off in 2 parties, which were to meet at an agreed place. The first party of this scientific expedition, which started from the town of Piatigorsk, consisted of 12 persons, and the second from the town of Essentuki of 21, of whom I was one. Officially, these 2 groups were considered quite independent of each other and as having nothing in common. Without really knowing the conditions then prevailing in this country, one must have a particularly fertile imagination to form even a rough idea of what it meant to organize a scientific expedition, moreover an official one, at such a time. From Essentuki, I intended to go first through inhabited districts to the Mount Indur, situated not far from Tuapse, and from there to begin searching in a southeasterly direction along a line from 25 to 60 miles distant from the shores of the Black Sea. For the first part of the journey I managed after great difficulties to procure from the Bolshevik government, which was then in power, 2 railway wagons, and this I did at a time when, owing to the constant movement of troops, it was almost unthinkable even for one man without luggage to travel by rail. Having squeezed into these wagons all 21 persons, 2 horses, 2 mules, and 3 2-wheeled carts, not to mention the great quantity of equipment bought for the expedition, such as tents, provisions, and various instruments and weapons, we started off. We traveled this way as far as Maikop, but since almost the whole roadbed of the railway beyond this town had been destroyed the previous day by a newly formed group of rebels who called themselves by such title as the Greens, our expedition was compelled to continue further on foot and by cart, and not in the direction of Tuapse, as I had originally intended, but towards what is known as the White River Pass. In order to reach uninhabited territory, we had to pass through populated districts, and to cross the Bolshevik and White Army lines no fewer than 5 times. Whenever I recall all those almost indescribable difficulties, even now that it is all over, and only a memory of the past, there arises in me a feeling of real satisfaction that I succeeded in surmounting them. It was indeed as if, during that whole period, miracles were being performed for us. The epidemic of fanaticism and mutual hatred which had seized all the people around us did not touch us at all. One might have said that I and my companions moved under supernatural protection. Just as our attitude towards each other was impartial, as if we were not of this world, so their attitude towards us was the same. They considered us completely neutral, as in truth we were. Surrounded by infuriated beasts of people ready to tear one another apart for the slightest booty, I moved amid this chaos quite openly and fearlessly, without concealing anything or resorting to any subterfuge. And in spite of the fact that requisitioning pillaging was in full swing, nothing was taken from us, not even the 2 casks of alcohol which, on account of great scarcity, were the envy of all. In telling you about this now, a feeling of justice, that very justice which comes from my understanding of the psyche of people subjected to such events, obliges me to pay a tribute to those of the Bolsheviks and White Army volunteers, most of them perhaps no longer alive, whose attitude of goodwill towards my activities, even though adopted unconsciously and purely instinctively, assisted the fortunate outcome of this dangerous enterprise of mine. Indeed, if I did manage to get safely out of that hell, in the full sense of the word, it was not due entirely to my well-developed ability to discern and play upon the slightest changes in the weaknesses of the psyche of people in a psychosis of this kind. In the condition in which these events were taking place, I would not have been able, even by maintaining the most active vigilance day and night, to foresee all the unexpected things that happened and to take corresponding measures. In my opinion, we got out safely because in the common presences of these people, although in the grip of a psychic state in which the last grain of reasonableness vanishes, the instinct inherent in all human beings for distinguishing good from evil, in the objective sense, was not completely lacking.
And therefore, instinctively sensing in my activities the living germ of that sacred impulse which alone is capable of bringing genuine happiness to humanity, they furthered in whatever way they could the process of accomplishment of that which I had undertaken long before this war. In all our dealings with them, there was never once a situation, either with the Bolsheviks or the White Army volunteers, from which I could not find some way out. Here I will add, by the way, that if at some time in the future the life of people would flow normally, and if there should then be specialists for investigating events similar to those which occurred in Russia, the various documents I have kept, which were issued to me by the 2 opposing sides for the protection of my interests and possessions, would furnish very instructive evidence of the extraordinary incidents that can occur during such mass psychoses. For example, among these numerous documents there is one paper on one side of which is written, "The bearer, Citizen Gurdjieff, has the right to carry everywhere a revolver, caliber, number, certified by signature and seal affixed. The President of the Soldiers and Workmen's Deputies, Rukadze. Place of issue, Essentuki. Date of issue. Secretary,
Shandarovsky. On the back of this paper is written, "A certain Gurdjieff is authorized to carry a revolver numbered as indicated on the reverse side, certified by signature and seal affixed, for General Denikin, General Heyman, Chief of Staff General Davidovich Nachinsky, issued in Mayakop, date." After tremendous efforts, surmounting numerous unexpected obstacles, we went through devastated Cossack villages and finally got to Komichki, the last inhabited place before the wilderness of the Caucasus Mountains. Beyond this point there were no passable roads. In Komichki, we made haste to procure whatever provisions were still obtainable, abandoned our carts to their fate, loaded most of our things in the horses and mules, and carrying the rest ourselves, began to climb up the everlasting mountains. Only after crossing the first pass did we at last breathe freely, feeling that the greatest dangers were behind us, but it was just here that the real difficulties of the journey began. About this part of the expedition from Komichki over the White River Pass to Sochi, across the wilds of the Caucasian Range, a journey which lasted about 2 months, filled with strange and even extraordinary adventures, I will not say anything. And this is because, according to information which has reached me, a description of this escape of ours from the center of hell to its edge, through the almost impassable wilds of these mountains, as well as of our successful investigation of dolmens and of all the visible and hidden riches of this region, has already been written and will doubtless soon be published by certain members of this singular scientific expedition, who subsequently returned to Russia and are now cut off from the rest of the world. The group of people round me on this journey happened quite unexpectedly to be of such diverse types and education as could not have been more suitable for the aims of our expedition, and they very effectively helped me resolve the problem of the dolmens. Among them were very good technicians and specialists in various branches of science, mining and other engineers, as well as specialists in archaeology, astronomy, zoology, medicine, and other fields of knowledge. I will only add that, of all my impressions during this journey, the most outstanding is of the beauty of the regions between Komichki and Sochi, especially of those from the pass down to the sea, which indeed deserve the high-sounding name of terrestrial paradise, often attributed to other parts of the Caucasus by the so-called intelligentsia. Although these regions would be quite suitable for agriculture as well as for watering places, and are not very far from populated centers, yet, in spite of the growing need for land of this sort, they remain, for some reason or other, uninhabited and undeveloped. They were formerly populated by the Cherkessis, who migrated to Turkey 40 or 50 years ago. Since then, they have been abandoned, and no man's foot has trod them. On our way, we sometimes came across formerly well-cultivated lands and excellent orchards, which, though overgrown and wild, were still yielding enough fruit to feed thousands. Well then, only at the end of about 2 months, worn out with fatigue and with our provisions almost gone, did we succeed in reaching the town of Sochi, on the shores of the Black Sea. Here, because certain members of the expedition, during what might be called our Way of Golgotha, were not equal to the situation, but manifested properties not corresponding at all to the high aim we had in view, I decided to part with them and went on with the others. We traveled now by ordinary roads to the town of Tiflis, where there was still, for that tumultuous time, a relative degree of order under the rule of Menshevik Democrats of Georgian nationality. 4 years had passed from the beginning of the organization of the Institute in Moscow up to the time of our arrival in Tiflis. Together with time had gone money, and all the more rapidly because toward the end of this period money had to be spent not only for the work of the Institute itself, but on much else besides which had not been foreseen in the original calculations. The trouble was that the catastrophic events in Russia, the colossal upheavals, the war and civil war, had shaken people out of their usual grooves, and everything was so mixed up and turned upside down that the wealthy and secure of yesterday found themselves the totally destitute of today. This was the situation of many of those who had left everything to follow my ideas, and who during this period, though their sincerity and corresponding manifestations had become like next of kin to me, and so I had now to provide a means of livelihood for nearly 200 people. My difficulty in this respect was complicated by the fact that many of my relatives were in a still worse position than the others, and I had not only to support them financially, but to provide shelter for them and all their families, since most of them had been living in places in Transcaucasia which had been completely devastated and pillaged in the Civil War and by the Turks. In order that you may picture to yourselves the generally prevailing horror, I will describe one of the many scenes I witnessed. This was at the time when I was in Essentuki, and life there was still relatively calm. I was maintaining 2 community houses for my relatives and the followers of my ideas, one for 85 people in Essentuki, and the other for 60 people in Piatigorsk. The already high cost of living was rising daily. It was becoming more and more difficult, even with large sums of money, to obtain food for the 2 houses, and I barely succeeded in making both ends meet. One rainy morning, while sitting at the window looking out at the street and thinking how to obtain this, that, and the other, I saw 2 odd-looking conveyances pull up at my door, from which a number of shadowy forms slowly emerged. At first it was even difficult for me to make out what they were, but as my agitated thoughts grew a little calmer, I gradually began to realize that these were people, or more exactly, skeletons of people, with only their burning eyes alive, clad in rags and tatters, their bare feet covered with wounds and sores. There were 28 in all, among them 11 children between the ages of 1 and 9. These people turned out to be relatives of mine, among them my own sister with her 6 little children. They had been living in Alexandropol, which, among other places, had been attacked by the Turks 2 months before. As neither the post nor the telegraph service were working, and the towns were cut off from each other, the inhabitants of Alexandropol only learned of the approaching attack when the Turks were about 3 miles from the city. This news gave rise to an indescribable panic. Just picture to yourself how people must feel when, worn out and strained to the extreme limit, they realize that the enemy, stronger and better armed than their own troops, will inevitably enter the city and will mercilessly and indiscriminately massacre not only the men, but the women, the aged, and the children, as was the order of things there. And so my relatives, like all the rest, learned of the approach of the Turks only about an hour beforehand, and, seized with this panic, fled in terror just as they were, without stopping to take anything with them. Quite bewildered and dashing off at random, they first even ran in the wrong direction. It was only when they were too exhausted to go further that they came to themselves a little, realized their mistake, and took the direction of Tiflis. After 20 long, painful days of walking over the mountains through almost impassable places, sometimes even crawling on hands and knees, hungry and cold. They finally arrived in Tiflis barely alive.
Having learned there that I was living in Essentuki, and that communications with that town were then open, they managed, with the help of friends, to hire 2 covered carts, and, barely moving along what was called the Georgian Military Road, they finally landed at my door, as I've just said, in such a state that they were not even recognizable. Imagine the situation of a man who sees such a picture and who, in spite of the extreme difficulties of the moment, considers himself to be, and in fact is, the only one able to shelter them, clothe them, care for them, and in short set them on their feet. All these unforeseen expenses, as well as the cost of the expedition and the money left to provide for those who stayed behind in the mineral water towns, had used up all my reserves by the time I arrived, with a whole following in Tiflis. Not only was my ready money gone, but also those valuables which my wife and I, during our constant moving about, had been able to carry with us. As for the other valuable things I had collected for many years, although a few had been disposed of, at the very beginning of the chaotic events in Russia, by some of my pupils from the 2 capitals, who afterwards came with their families to be near me in Essentuki, all the rest, including the 2 unique collections I have mentioned, remained partly in Petrograd and partly in Moscow, and I had no idea what had become of them. By the 2nd day after my arrival in Tiflis, matters had come to such a pass that I found myself without a single cent in my pocket. I had to beg the wife of one of my people to lend, or simply give me, her last ring, containing a small diamond of approximately 1 1/4 carats, which I immediately sold so that everyone might eat that evening. Things were made still more difficult by the illness I had contracted while crossing the Caucasus Mountains, where one is subject to enormous differences of temperature between the day and night. My condition became worse, since I could not lie in bed, but with temperature as high as 104, was compelled to run about the city in order to find at any cost some way out of this desperate situation. I acquainted myself with all the prospects of the local business world, and having seen that in spite of the general depression throughout Transcaucasia, the trade in both new and old Oriental carpets was still flourishing, I at once decided to occupy myself with this business. I chose several qualified persons from those who had come there with me, and also from those of my relatives who had lived there a long time, and having taught them how to assist me, I very quickly organized a serious business in carpets. Some of my assistants went round in Tiflis and the neighboring towns and searched for and bought up all sorts of carpets. A second group washed and cleaned them, while a third repaired them. The carpets were then sorted out, and some of them were sold retail, and the others wholesale, either for the local trade or for export to Constantinople. By the 3rd week this carpet business had begun to bring in such an income that there was not only sufficient money for all to live on, but a great deal left over. In view of these profits and the obviously still greater prospects of this business, the desire arose in me to establish my institute on a temporary basis there, without waiting for peace and my return to Moscow. The more so as I had always intended to open a branch of the Institute in Tiflis. While continuing the carpet business, I therefore set about organizing the Institute. But it soon became clear, in view of the great housing crisis in Tiflis at the time, that it would be impossible for me to find quarters suitable for my purpose unaided, and I applied to the Georgian government for assistance. The Georgian government met me halfway,
and directed the mayor of Tiflis to assist me in every way to find a building worthy of such an important establishment of general public significance, and to place it entirely at my disposal. The mayor himself and several members of the municipal council who were interested in my work were indeed very assiduous in searching for the necessary building. But in spite of their good will, they could not find anything suitable, and offered me temporary quarters, promising to change them shortly for something permanent and more adequate. Thus, for the third time, I began the organization of the Institute, and first of all set about the same inevitable business of acquiring the necessary furnishings and equipment. Here, among the inhabitants of Tiflis, many people had been deeply affected by the change in their conditions of life, and felt the need to turn towards other values. As a consequence, within a week after the opening of my institute, all the special classes which had been started in these temporary premises were filled up, and there were also waiting lists of 2 or 3 times as many people for the classes I expected to start as soon as we had a larger building. In these temporary premises, which were unsuitable in every respect and under exceedingly trying conditions, work on oneself began to come to life. Studies were carried on for several months by dividing the pupils into separate groups, and by arranging working hours in the morning, afternoon, and evening, and even late at night. But the government kept putting off the question of the promised building week after week, and it became more and more impossible to continue the work in our inadequate premises. And when, owing to the Bolsheviks' advance in Georgia, all the harassing difficulties of daily living increased, and the Georgian government itself was shaken, I finally gave up wasting my time and energy in the struggle with the conditions round me. I decided not only to liquidate everything in Tiflis, but even to break with everything that up till then had tied me to Russia, and to emigrate beyond its borders and found my institute in some other country. I sold for a mere song everything acquired by the institute in Tiflis, and, providing as well as possible for those of us who remained behind, I left under great difficulties for Constantinople, taking with me 30 people. At the time of my departure from Tiflis, the sale of carpets had brought me a considerable sum of money. I calculated that, even after providing for the people remaining behind, and allowing for the expenses of the journey, there would still be enough on arriving in Constantinople to last for a fairly long period. Alas, we had counted without the Georgians. Thanks to them, we were not able to make use of this money which had been earned, literally by the sweat of our brows. This happened because the local currency at that time had no value outside the country and could not be exchanged anywhere. So those who went abroad took with them, instead of currency, diamonds or rugs. I likewise decided to take, instead of money, several precious stones, and 20 rare carpets, and having fulfilled all the official requirements for their export, I distributed them among my companions. Yet, on leaving Batum, although we had the documents certifying that we had paid all the duties and taxes, the so-called Special Georgian Detachment, quibbling about something or other, confiscated quite illegally, supposedly only temporarily, almost all the carpets I had distributed among the people accompanying me. Later, at Constantinople, when we took steps to recover them, Batum had been occupied by the Bolsheviks. The scoundrelly detachment with its chiefs had dispersed, and of course there was no trace of the rugs. Of the 20, only 2 were saved, having come via the diplomatic bag entrusted by the Finnish consul to a Finnish member of the Institute. And so, I found myself in Constantinople in almost the same situation as on arriving in Tiflis. I had at my disposal only 2 small diamonds and the 2 remaining rugs. From the sale of these, even at a good price, I could not count on enough money to provide for such a crowd of people for more than a very short time, especially since all of us needed clothes. When we were living in Tiflis, there were no clothes to be had, and all our things were so ragged that it was impossible to go about in them in this city, where life was more or less normal. But luck was with me. I immediately ran across several fortunate business transactions. Among other things, I collaborated with an old friend and countryman of mine in the resale of large consignments of caviar. In addition, I participated in the sale of a certain ship, and my finances improved once more. While still in Tiflis, I had renounced, once and for all, the idea of making Russia the permanent center of the activities of my institute. But I did not then know the conditions of life in Europe well enough to have any definite plan as to where to settle. On thinking it over, however, it seemed to me that Germany, owing to its central geographical position and its cultural level, about which I had heard so much, would be the country most suitable for my purposes. But having been held up in Constantinople because of the eternal question of money, so painful for all those who have no uncle in America, I had to occupy myself there for several months longer with all sorts of business deals in order to have enough cash to go on further. Meanwhile, so that the people who had accompanied me should, as is said, continue with the work, I rented the only large premises I could find in the part of Constantinople called Prieure, where almost all the Europeans live. And whenever I was free from my commercial affairs, I directed the class in movements which had been begun in Tiflis, arranging public demonstrations on every Saturday to accustom the pupils not to be embarrassed in the presence of strangers. The local Turks and Greeks, who assembled in large numbers to watch these demonstrations, showed a great interest in the movements and in the music which I had composed specially for them, as well as in the various activities carried on by my people in preparation for future work of the Institute in Germany. And I received an ever-growing number of requests from the visitors to be allowed to take part. At the same time, the generally unstable situation in Europe continued to threaten all my projects, since the mutual distrust between governments made the obtaining of visas for foreign countries very difficult. And there were also great fluctuations of the rates of exchange from day to day. I decided, therefore, that I would extend the range of my activities there in Constantinople by organizing public lectures to elucidate various aspects of my fundamental ideas, and by opening courses for the study of 3 fields of human manifestation, namely movements, music, and painting, considered in their relationship to objective science. And so once again I plunged headlong into feverish activity, continuing to make money by every possible means in Constantinople itself, as well as in Kadikoy, on the opposite side of the Bosphorus, to which I had to cross over by boat almost every day. All the rest of my time I devoted to the classes I had organized, in which a great many new pupils were now participating, so that the only moments I could find to draft the synopsis of the series of lectures, which were to be read by certain specially prepared pupils, were during my trips to and fro on the ferry and in tram-cars. I lived in this feverish activity for about a year, until the long-awaited visas arrived, by which time the chronic hole in my pocket made by the rapid flow of money through it had finally become somewhat stopped up, and something had even begun to accumulate in the folds. Since at that time the wiseacring of the young Turks began to have a particular smell, I decided, without waiting for the various delights which were bound to develop in connection with these wiseacrings, to get away with my people as quickly as possible, with our skins whole. So, having speedily transferred my classes to Chateau, and placed at their head some of the most qualified of my new pupils, I left for Germany. Arriving in Berlin, I obtained lodging in various hotels for all the people who had traveled with me, and rented in a part of Berlin called Schmargendorf a large hall for continuing the interrupted work. And then I immediately began to travel about Germany, going to different places where various acquaintances had found possible buildings for the Institute. After seeing a certain number of them, I finally chose in Hellerau, near the city of Dresden, a house which had been specially designed and equipped on a rather grand scale for a new cultural movement, recently much talked about, called the Dalkroz system. Finding this house and its installations more or less suitable for the founding and further development of the headquarters of the Institute, I resolved to acquire the complete establishment. But while carrying on negotiations with the owner, a proposition was made to me by a group of English people, who had become interested in my ideas, to open the main institute in London, and they offered to undertake all the expenses and problems of organization. In view of the precarious financial situation brought about by the continuing crisis in every country, affecting both myself and those whom I had dealings, I was tempted by this offer, and went to London to see for myself the state of affairs there on the spot. As the progress of the work in Berlin under my direction was of great importance to me, and any prolonged absence would have been detrimental, and as I could not work out all the questions connected with the English proposal in a short time, I decided to travel to London every 2 or 3 weeks for several days, and each time I went by a different route in order to become acquainted with other European countries. As a result of my observations during these journeys, I came to the definite conclusion that the best place for the foundation of the Institute would be neither Germany nor England, but France. France gave me the impression of a country which was then politically and economically more stable than the others, and although less central geographically than Germany, yet its capital, Paris, was considered the capital of the world. So France seemed to be a sort of crossroads of all the races and nationalities on earth. Consequently, to my eyes, it appeared to be the most suitable base for the diffusion of my ideas. England, owing to its insular situation, would not have allowed any development in this respect. An institute founded there would have taken on the narrow character of a local institution. That is why on one of my journeys to London I definitely refused to found the central establishment there. But I agreed to send over instructors, specially prepared by me, and also a certain number of my pupils, who were to be maintained there until the opening of an English branch of the main institute. In short, we arrived in France during the summer of 1922. There I found that, after having paid all the expenses of the journey, I had at my disposal only 100,000 francs. Having arranged in Paris a temporary lodging house for my pupils, I rented the Dalkroz school as a temporary hall for the continuation of our work, and began to look for a house and also for funds to establish the institute. After a long search, the most suitable of the many properties I inspected near Paris proved to be an estate named the Chateau de Prieure, situated not far from the famous Chateau de Fontainebleau. The owner of this chateau, who had inherited it from a celebrated lawyer, and who wished to be rid of it as soon as possible owing to the great expense of its upkeep, preferred to sell rather than rent. Having several buyers in view, she dragged out negotiations with me, manifesting thereby the tendency which contemporary meteorologists would formulate in the words, either snow or rain or something or other. On my side, as you well understand, the depleted state of my exchequer at that time gave me no possibility of buying it. Finally, after much beating about the bush and many stipulations, the owner consented to postpone the sale of the property for a year, and to rent it to me for this period for 65,000 francs, giving me 6 months to decide whether I would buy, after which she would have the right to sell the property to another party, and I would be obliged to vacate without delay. Having leased the Chateau de Prieure under these conditions, I moved to this estate the next day with 50 pupils. This was on the 1st of October, 1922. From that day on, under specifically European conditions quite foreign to me, there began one of the maddest periods of my life. When I walked through the gates of the Chateau de Prieure, it was as though, right behind the old porter, I was greeted by Mrs. Serious Problem. My 100,000 francs, down to the last sou, had already been scattered to the winds, partly in paying the rent of the property and partly in the expenses of living for 3 months in Paris with so many people. And now, besides continuing to maintain such a crowd of people, I had to face the immediate prospect of spending another large sum of money on furnishings and equipment, since neither the furniture nor other household articles in the place had been planned for such a number of residents, with a further large number coming from England, as the branch in London had not been opened. My situation was further complicated by the fact that when I arrived in Paris I spoke no Western European language. On my departure from Batoum, this question of languages had begun to disturb me. But in Constantinople I had nothing to worry about, since the languages chiefly used there were Turkish, Greek, and Armenian, all of which I knew well. As soon as I left Constantinople, however, and arrived in Berlin, great difficulties in this respect began to appear for me. And now here in Paris, faced with the necessity of again finding means to cover colossal expenses, I felt more than ever the need to know European languages, while at the time I did not have a minute in which to apply myself to learning them. To do business through interpreters was next to impossible, especially for commercial transactions, where one needs to catch the mood of the man one is dealing with and to play on his psyche. Even with a good interpreter, the long pauses necessary for the translation destroy all the effect one has made, not to mention the difficulty of rendering the intonations always so important in such negotiations. And I did not even have a good interpreter, since all the people who might have helped me in this problem came from other countries, and knew French as foreigners usually do, and Russians in particular, that is to say, just enough for what is called drawing-room conversation, and even then not in France. While all this time I needed sound French for serious commercial negotiations. The amount of nervous energy I wasted during those first 2 years in France, at the moments when I felt that what I had said was not being translated correctly, would doubtless have been quite sufficient for 100 of your novice brokers on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. In view of the fact that on arriving at the Chateau de Prieure, a considerable sum was urgently needed for furnishings, which would be impossible to earn at once, I began to look about for a possibility of obtaining a loan to cover the most pressing needs. My intention was to organize the work of the Institute for the time being in such a way that I could devote half of my time to earning money, and thus gradually paying off what I had borrowed. I succeeded in arranging this loan in London, where I borrowed from various persons interested in the Institute. This was the first time I departed from the fundamental principle I had imposed upon myself 15 years before, namely, to take on myself sole responsibility for the accomplishment of my work, without accepting any material help from outside. I can categorically affirm that until then, in spite of the enormous expenses and the failures and losses brought about through no fault of mine, but through the political and economic circumstances of the preceding years, I did not owe a cent to anyone. Everything was the result of my own labor. Friends and people who had interest in or sympathy for my ideas had many times offered me money, but I had always refused, even at difficult moments, preferring to surmount the obstacles by my own efforts rather than betray my principles. Having alleviated the immediate difficulty at the Prieure by this loan, I set myself red-hot to work. My task at this period was, one can indeed say, superhuman. Sometimes I had to work literally 24 hours a day, all night long at Fontainebleau, and the whole day in Paris, or vice versa. Even the time of traveling back and forth by train was taken up with correspondence and negotiations. The work went well, but the excessive pressure of these months, immediately following 8 years of uninterrupted labor, fatigued me to such a point that my health was severely shaken. And despite all my desire and effort, I could no longer maintain the same intensity. In spite of the obstacles which hindered and restricted my work, the poor state of my health, the difficulty of carrying on business negotiations without knowing the language, and the number of my enemies which increased, as has long ago become a law, proportionately with the number of friends, I nevertheless managed to accomplish within the first 6 months most of what I had planned to do. Since for most of you Americans, particularly in modern times, the only effective stimulus for the flow of thoughts is the familiar image of a balance sheet, I wish at least to enumerate for you, quite simply, the expenses that I succeeded in meeting from the time of my entering the Chateau de Prieure up to my departure for your America. The following is approximately what was paid. Half the cost of a large property, plus a substantial sum toward the purchase of a small adjacent property. The entire cost of the initial outfitting and installation of the Institute, including repairs, alterations, and putting of the property into shape. Purchase of miscellaneous materials, tools, and agricultural machinery. Instruments and apparatus for the medical section, etc. Purchase of livestock, horses, cows, sheep, pigs, poultry, etc. To all this was added the considerable cost of the construction, fitting out and decoration of a building intended among other things for the exercises of movements and for demonstrations. A building called by some the study house, and by others the theatre. Finally, I succeeded during this period, even while providing for the needs of guests and pupils of the Institute, in paying back part of the loan I had contracted. One of the best sources of income during these months was the psychological treatment of certain difficult cases of alcoholism and drug addiction. I was widely considered one of the best specialists in this field, and the families of these unfortunates sometimes offered me very substantial sums for giving up my time to them. I remember especially a rich American couple who entrusted me with their son, judged to be incurable, and who spontaneously doubled the agreed fee in their joy at his cure. In addition, I went into partnership with some businessmen, and undertook with them a number of financial ventures. I made a considerable profit, for instance, from the resale, at an unexpectedly good price, of a whole block of oil shares. I made 2 profitable business deals with a partner by opening one after the other 2 restaurants in Montmartre, which I organized in a few weeks and sold as soon as they were well launched. It even seems strange to me how easily I can now enumerate the results of my efforts during that period, when I remember how they were always accompanied by inner experiences disturbing the whole of me and demanding an incredible tension of my forces. During these months, I had to be at work at 8 in the morning and only finished at 10 or 11 in the evening. I spent the rest of the night in Montmartre, not only for my restaurant business, but also for the treatment of an alcoholic who got drunk every night in that quarter, and who gave me a great deal of difficulty because he did not wish to be cured. It is worth mentioning that my external life at this period, when I was spending every night in Montmartre, provided many of those who knew me, or had seen or heard about me, with rich material for gossip. Some envied my opportunities for gay revels, others condemned me. As for me, I would not have wished such revels even for my bitterest enemy. In short, the urgent necessity of finding a stable solution for the financial problem of the Prieure, the hope of finally freeing myself from these chronic material cares, and the wish to be able to devote myself entirely to my real work, that is, to the teaching of the ideas and methods on which the Institute was based, a wish postponed in its fulfillment from year to year owing to circumstances over which I had no control, all led me to make superhuman efforts, regardless of the disastrous consequences that might ensue for me. But in spite of all my reluctance to stop, as is said, halfway, I was compelled again to interrupt everything just before completing the preparation of those conditions which alone would have made it possible to accomplish the fundamental tasks of the Institute. During the last months of this period, the state of my health had indeed become so poor that I was compelled to reduce my hours of work. And then, when I began to be affected by certain ailments I had never had before in my life, I confess I became worried, and decided to cease all active work, both mental and physical. However, I continually put off doing so, up to the day when a bad chill forced me willy-nilly to stop everything. The circumstances are worth describing. One evening, I finished my work in Paris earlier than usual, at about 10 o'clock, and as I had to be at the Prieure without fail the next morning, where an engineer was coming to discuss plans and estimates for a special steam bath I intended to construct, I decided to go there at once, go to bed early, and have a good sleep. So, without stopping anywhere, not even at my apartment in town, I started off for Fontainebleau. The weather was damp. I closed the windows of my car, and during the trip I was feeling so well that I even began to make plans in my mind for a pottery kiln, which I intended to construct before long at the Institute in the ancient Persian style. On approaching the Fontainebleau forest, I was thinking to myself that I would soon be coming to a place where in damp weather there was often fog late at night. I looked at my watch. It was 11:15. I put on the large headlights and accelerated the car in order to pass this damp place more quickly. From that moment on I remembered nothing, neither how I drove nor what happened. When I came to myself, I saw the following picture. I was sitting in the car, which stood right there on the roadway. Around me was the forest. The sun was shining brightly. A big wagon loaded with hay had stopped in front of the car, and the driver was standing at my window, tapping on it with his whip. And it was this which had awakened me. It seems that in the evening, after looking at my watch, I must have gone on about 1 kilometer, and then fallen asleep against my will, which had never happened to me in my life before, I had slept on until 10 o'clock in the morning. Luckily, the car had stopped nearly where it should have been according to French traffic regulations, and all the morning traffic must have passed me without disturbing my sleep. But this wagon load was too big to pass, and the driver had to wake me. Although I had slept very well in these strange conditions, the chill I caught that night was so severe that even now I can feel its effects. From then on it became very difficult for me, even with violence to myself, to demand from my body too strenuous an effort. Willy-nilly I had to stop all my business. The situation of the Institute therefore became critical in the extreme. Not only was it impossible to complete indispensable tasks, but everything already accomplished was threatened with ruin, because bills were coming due and no one was equal to taking care of them in my place. I would have to contrive something. One day, when I was sitting on the entrance of the Grand Café, famous among foreigners, thinking about my current affairs and how they were affected by my state of health, I reflected as follows.
As in my present condition I cannot, and at least for a certain time must not, work with the intensity which is required for such a great task, but must on the contrary allow myself a complete rest, even if only temporarily, why should I not immediately carry out the plan I have made to go to America, without waiting to complete the preparations for the trip? A tour through the different states of North America with constant traveling and change of environment, far from the usual surroundings and consequently always with new impressions, will create the necessary conditions, in accordance with my established subjectivity, for a complete rest. All the more so because I will be far away from the place where my present interests are concentrated, and free for a while from a certain feature of my character which I know only too well from repeated experiences during my frequent travels through wild countries. Each time I have been subjected to the kind manifestations of God's creatures, quadruped as well as biped, and however badly I have been battered by them, as soon as I am even slightly better, this feature always impels me to somehow struggle back on my feet and plunge at once into the enterprise in hand. In order that you may understand what I mean by not waiting to complete the preparations for the trip to America, I must tell you that when the Institute in France was first organized, I began to prepare material for a series of lectures which would make known to the public the fundamental ideas of the Institute and the applications to different domains, such as psychology, medicine, archaeology, art, architecture, and even to the various, as they are called, supernatural phenomena. In addition, I had begun to prepare pupils for a series of demonstrations which I wished to present on a tour through Europe and America. My aim was to introduce in this way into the process of the everyday life of people the significance of these ideas, and to show the practical results to which they could lead. Ideas based on material I had collected in different parts of Asia, inaccessible to the average man. As a result of these reflections on the terrace of the Grand Café, I decided to take the risk of leaving at once, simply with the material which had already been prepared. I even gave myself my word not to work on anything serious whatsoever, from the moment of leaving France until returning there, but to eat well, sleep a great deal, and read only books whose contents and style were in keeping with the spirit and character of the stories of Mullah Nasr-ed-Din. I was ready to run the risk of this venture because I was beginning to hope that my pupils would now be capable of organizing various lectures and demonstrations in America by themselves, without my participation. One of the chief dangers of carrying out this sudden decision which I had made for the two purposes of restoring my health and adjusting the finances of my institute. This child I had conceived, and had borne with incredible difficulties, and which was only just beginning to live an independent life, stemmed from the fact that in order to succeed, it was necessary to take with me no less than 46 people, who, in America as in France, would be of course entirely in my care. It was the only way to resolve the agonizing material problem, but it was impossible not to take into account that, in the event of failure, the general situation would be still worse and could even lead to complete catastrophe. What a trip to America with 46 people meant financially, you with your passion for making frequent trips from this continent to Europe will easily comprehend, even without any of your discussions. And you can better weigh the gravity of this madcap step if you will take into consideration the simple fact that for your trips you change your dollars into francs, whereas I, on the contrary, had to change my francs into dollars. At the moment of deciding to go, the only money I had in reserve was the 300,000 francs which I had collected and set aside for the payment due on the 15th of February, the day when the deed of purchase of the Chateau de Prieure was finally to be signed. I nonetheless resolved to risk spending this money on the trip, and hurriedly began to prepare for our departure. While proceeding with the preparations necessary for such an expedition, that is, buying tickets, arranging visas, purchasing clothing, making costumes for the demonstrations of dances, and so forth, I concentrated all my attention on the classes of movements, and increased the number of rehearsals held in the now completed study house. Noticing once again how embarrassed the participants were in the presence of strangers, I decided to give, just before sailing, several public demonstrations at the Theatre Champs-Élysées in Paris. Although I knew that this last-minute undertaking of mine would cost a pretty penny, I did not in the least expect that the total would soar to such fantastic heights. And indeed, the Paris demonstrations, the steamship tickets, the paying of the most urgent bills, the provisions of money for those who were staying in Europe, as well as certain unforeseen expenses, which made their appearance almost imperceptibly, swallowed up the whole of the 300,000 francs even before my departure. And so I found myself the last minute in a super-unique tragic-comic situation. Everything was ready for our departure, but I could not sail. To set out on such a long journey with such a number of people and not have any reserve cash for any emergency was, of course, unthinkable. The situation revealed itself in all its splendor 3 days before the sailing of the boat. And then, as has happened to me more than once in critical moments of my life, there occurred an entirely unexpected event. What occurred was one of those interventions that people who are capable of thinking consciously, in our times and particularly in past epochs, have always considered a sign of the just providence of the higher powers. As for me, I would say that it was the law-conformable result of a man's unflinching perseverance in bringing all his manifestations in accordance with the principles he has consciously set himself in life for the attainment of a definite aim. This event took place as follows. I was sitting in my room at the Prieure, searching in my mind for a way out of the incredible situation that had arisen, when suddenly the door opened, and my old mother came in. She had arrived only a few days before with several members of my family who had stayed on in the Caucasus after my departure from Russia. And it was only recently that I had succeeded, after a great deal of trouble, in getting them to France. My mother came over to me and handed me a small packet, saying, "Please, Relieve me of this thing. I am so tired of always carrying it around." At first I did not understand what she was talking about, and automatically untied the packet. But when I saw what was in it, I almost jumped up and danced for joy. To explain to you what this thing was, which at this desperate moment could arouse in me such a feeling of gladness, I must first tell you that when I went to live in Essentuki, the agitation of minds which had spread everywhere in Russia evoked in the consciousness of every more or less sensible person a foreboding of ominous events to come, and I therefore sent for my old mother, then at Alexandropol, to come and live with me. And later, when I went off on the scientific expedition I had mentioned, I entrusted her to those who remained behind in Essentuki. Then, I must tell you that in that year, 1918, in the Caucasus, as in all of Russia, the value of the ruble was declining daily, and everyone who had money bought objects of universal use and more stable value, such as precious stones, precious metals, rare antiques, and so on. I also converted all my capital into valuables which I always carried on my person. But at the time of the departure of the expedition from Essentuki, since pillaging raged everywhere under the guise of search and requisition, I would have incurred a great risk in carrying all these valuables myself, so I distributed part of them among my companions, in the hope that even if we did not escape the pillaging, there would nevertheless be a chance for some of us to save something, and the rest I divided among those who remained in Essentuki and Piatigorsk, among whom was my mother. One of the things I gave my mother was a brooch, which I had bought shortly before in Essentuki from a certain Grand Duchess, who was in great need of money. And on giving it to my mother, I told her that she should take particular care of it, as it was very valuable. I was sure that, constrained by necessity, my family must have sold this brooch soon after my departure, or, if not, that it had been stolen during their constant moving from place to place, because each town at that time was at the mercy of a band of pillagers, without respect for anyone or anything, or finally that it had been lost on the journey 20 times over. In short, I had completely forgotten about this brooch, and the thought of bringing it into my calculations could never have arisen in any corner of my brain. But it seems that when I entrusted the brooch to my mother, and asked her to take particular care of it, she thought that it must be very valuable to me personally as a remembrance, and had to be returned to me.
All these years she had guarded it as the apple of her eye, had avoided showing it to any of her family, and had always carried it about with her like a talisman, sewn up in a little bag. And now she was glad to be able to return it to me at last, and to be rid of something that had been a constant worry for her. Can you imagine my relief when I recognized this brooch and realized at once how I could make use of it? On the following day, with this brooch in my pocket, I was in a position to borrow $2,000 from a friend. But I took this valuable to America with me, since in Paris I was offered only 125,000 francs for it, whereas in my opinion it was worth much more, and I found I was not mistaken when I sold it here in New York. At this point in his narrative Mr. Gurdjieff paused, and with his particular smile began to smoke a cigarette. In the silence reigning in the room, Mr. H. rose from his place, went over to Mr. Gurdjieff and said, "Mr. Gurdjieff, I really do not know, after all the joking remarks you have seen fit to make about the material question, whether it is due to the particular order in which you have told your story today, or to my naivete or suggestibility. But beyond all doubt, at this moment, I am ready with my whole being to do anything to lighten the enormous burden you have voluntarily taken upon yourself." And I shall perhaps be even nearer the truth if I tell you that this impulse has arisen in me owing to the distinct impression I received throughout your narrative that in taking upon yourself this high task, a task beyond the limits of strength of an ordinary man, you have always up till now been absolutely alone. Allow me to put into your hands this check, which represents all that I have at my disposal at this moment. At the same time, in the presence of all those here, I pledge myself to deliver the same sum to you every year for the rest of my life, wherever you may be, and whatever may be your circumstances. When Mr. H. had finished speaking, and, visibly moved, was wiping his forehead with his handkerchief, Mr. Gurdjieff stood up, and, placing a hand on his shoulder, looked at him with that penetrating, kind, and grateful look of his, which I personally can never forget, and said simply, "Thank you, my, from today, God-given brother." But the strongest proof of the great impression produced by the narrative of Mr. Gurdjieff was the declaration of a certain Lady L., who was visiting in New York, and was present that evening as the guest of Mr. R. She suddenly said with great sincerity, "Mr. Gurdjieff, it is somewhat by chance that I am present at this meeting in honor of the opening of the branch of your institute in New York, and that I have been able to hear your story, which has intensely interested me. But before this I have more than once had the opportunity to hear something of your activities, and of the beneficent ideas to which your institute has given life. And I have even had the good fortune to be admitted to one of your demonstrations, which you organized every week in the study house, in the park of the Prieure, and to see with my own eyes certain other striking examples of your achievements. It will not surprise you, therefore, if I tell you that I have thought of your work many times, and have always felt a desire to be useful to you in some way. And now, after having heard the story of your indefatigable efforts, and felt with a woman's intuition the truth of what you are bringing to humanity, I understand how greatly your activities are paralyzed by the lack of that which has become today the motive power in the life of people. I mean money. And so I also wish to bring my contribution to your great work. In comparison with most people, my resources are certainly not small, and should permit me to offer you a rather large sum. In reality, they just suffice to meet the established requirements of life according to my social position. I have been thinking all evening what I could do for you, and I have thought of the money which little by little I have laid aside and deposited in a bank for a rainy day. Until I can do better, I have decided to put half of this temporarily at your disposal, without interest, until such time as, God forbid, some serious occurrence might require me to make use of these savings, as one never knows what the future may hold." During Lady L's heartfelt speech, Mr. Gurdjieff listened to her attentively with a kindly and serious expression. Then he replied, "Thank you, esteemed Lady L. I particularly appreciate your frankness, and if I accept this sum of money, which will be of great assistance to me in my present activities, I, in my turn, must speak frankly to you. Lifting for once the veil of the future, I can tell you with special gratitude that I shall be able to return this sum to you in exactly 8 years, at a time when, although in perfect health, you will have the greatest need of what constitutes today, as you have so correctly said, the motive force of the entire process of the life of man." Mr. Gurdjieff remained silent for a long time, as though immersed in heavy thoughts. Suddenly he looked tired. His eyes rested a moment on each of us. I am now revising this manuscript from notes of my pupils, sitting in a restaurant in the city of New York named Child's, at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 56th Street. In the same conditions in which I have always done my writing during the past 6 years, that is, in various public places such as cafes, restaurants, clubs, or dance halls, since the manifestations, contrary to my nature and unworthy of man, which are usual in places of this kind, apparently have a beneficial influence on the productivity of my work, and I do not find it superfluous to point out a single fact, which you are at liberty to consider pure coincidence, or even the effect of supernatural providence, namely, that without any intention on my part, but perhaps simply because in my work as a writer I always conform to an exact order, I have finished the revision of this text today, in this same city, exactly 7 years to the very day since the evening which has just been described. In order to complete this narrative, I will simply add, on the subject of my first trip to America, that although the undertaking was risky to say the least, with a troop of people not having a cent in their pockets, and not speaking a word of the local language, with the program of the proposed demonstrations not yet completed, and without any advanced publicity such as is usual, particularly in America, the success of this tour of demonstrations for the purpose of making known the results of the work of the Institute far outstripped my expectations. I may boldly state that if I had not had a serious accident a few days after my return to France, which prevented me from going back to America 6 months later, as I had intended, everything I had accomplished on this continent, with the help of those who had accompanied me, would have allowed me not only to repay all my debts, but even to ensure for the future the existence of all the branches of the Institute for the harmonious development of man, both those already in activity and those I intended to open the following year. But is it worth talking about now? In writing about this period of my life, there involuntarily arises in my memory that saying of our dear Mullah Nasruddin, "Do not recall with grief the beautiful hair of the convict's head." As I was writing these last words, someone came and sat down at my table. All my acquaintances, without exception, know the condition imposed on everyone who comes to talk to me, which is to wait until I have finished writing and begin the conversation myself. Let it be said in passing that, although they have always respected this condition, I have nonetheless very often sensed that, while fulfilling the requirements scrupulously, some of them were grinding their teeth as if ready to drown me in a spoonful of the latest fashionable medicine. When I had finished writing, I turned to the newcomer and, from the first words he spoke, a series of reflections and deductions was started in me, the whole of which brought me to a categorical decision. If, just as I am concluding, I would now refrain from speaking about this categorical decision and the reflections which brought it into being, I would be acting in contrary to the fundamental principles which run like a red thread all through this narrative. To understand my situation at this moment, you must know that the person who came to sit at my table, and who left after receiving the requisite instructions from me, was no other than my secret partner in the wholesale trade in antiques. I say secret because no one, not even any of the people nearest to me, knows about these business relations of mine. I had entered into these relations with him 6 years previously, a few months after my accident. I was then still very weak physically, but with my customary faculty of thinking re-established, I began to cognize in all its nakedness my material situation of that date, due partly to the enormous expenses of the trip to America, and partly to the expenses incurred on account of the serious illness of my mother and my wife. As prolonged lying in bed was becoming an increasingly unbearable moral torment for me, I began taking trips by car to try to relieve this suffering by taking in various impressions, and also in order to get wind of some business deal suitable for my condition at that time.
Accompanied by several people who were constantly with me, I began to go about everywhere, chiefly to the gathering places of Russian refugees in Paris. It was thus that one day in one of the famous cafes in Paris, a man came over to me whom I did not immediately recognize. It was only during the course of the conversation that I remembered having met him many times in various towns of the Caucasus, Transcaucasia, and the Transcaspian region. Traveling from town to town through these countries, he had been engaged in trading in all kinds of antiques, and had met me because almost everywhere in Asia I was known as an expert on antiques, and as a very good dealer in rugs, Chinese porcelain, and cloisonné. He told me, among other things, that he had managed to salvage a certain capital from the disaster in Russia, and that, making use of his knowledge of English, he was engaged in the same business in Europe. In telling me about his affairs, he complained that the chief difficulty was that in Europe the market was flooded with all kinds of imitations, and suddenly he asked me, "By the way, my dear fellow countryman, how about going into partnership with me, if only for the appraisal and valuation of the antiques?" The result of our talk was that we drew up an agreement which brought about my participation in his business for 4 years. Before purchasing any of the antiques, he was to bring them to me for my appraisal, or if they happened to be in places which more or less fitted in with the itinerary of the trips I had to take for many reasons during my activities as a writer, I would go myself to inspect them and communicate my opinion to him in a way agreed upon. So it continued for a certain time. He would spend the whole year traveling about Europe, unearthing and buying all sorts of rare pieces, which he would bring here to America and sell to antique dealers, chiefly in New York. As for me, I was only a partner for appraising the antiques. However, last year, when the crisis in my material situation reached its zenith, while at the same time this business continued to do well since numerous outlets had been found and Europe was overflowing with merchandise of this kind, I had the idea of restoring my finances by this means, and I decided that the scale of the operations carried on by my partner should be expanded as much as possible. With this aim, instead of allowing myself some rest before and after my tiring journeys, as had been my habit in recent years, I began to devote all my available time to making arrangements for borrowing money from various people who trusted me, and with whom I was in contact for one reason or another. Having thus collected a sum of several million francs, I invested all of it in this business. Encouraged by the development of our enterprise and the prospect of substantial profits, my partner worked to procure merchandise without sparing his strength, and as agreed upon, he arrived in America this year with this whole collection, 6 weeks before I came here myself. Unfortunately, however, a general economic depression had meanwhile come about, particularly affecting this trade, and we could no longer count on any profit, nor even hope for the recovery of our capital. And this was precisely what he came to tell me. What words should I use this time to describe the unexpected material situation in which I now found myself, when I have just referred to the crisis of last year as having reached its zenith? I cannot find a better expression than that of Mullah Nasr ad-Din which I have just this moment remembered. Ah, it's no great wonder that a bald daughter should be born to the oldest spinster of the village by that rascal of a mullah. But now if an elephant's head and a donkey's tail should grow on a bedbug, that indeed would be astonishing. And to understand why my material situation had again passed through such a crisis, it is not necessary to have a college education. Last year, when I first had the idea of developing my antique business in America on a large scale, I estimated and was fully convinced that this project of mine would yield a profit that would suffice not only to pay off all my accumulated debts, but would also enable me, without depending on anyone, to publish the first series of my writings, which I counted on having finished by then, and after that to give all my time on the second series. But unfortunately this unforeseen American crisis had plunged me, as Mullah Nasruddin would say, into such a deep galosh that today I can scarcely see a single streak of daylight out of it. For 6 years, for the purpose of preparing the material for the 3 series of books I intended to write, I had always and everywhere, in all conditions and circumstances, to remember myself, and to remember the task I had set myself, by the fulfillment of which I wished, and still wish, to justify the sense and aim of my life. I had to hold myself without weakening, while experiencing all kinds of feelings, to an extremely intense level of inner activity in order not to identify myself with anything, and I had to resist, with a merciless attitude toward myself, any change in the automatically flowing process of mental and emotional associations demanded for the themes of thought which I had been working out during this time. And finally, I had to force myself not to neglect or omit anything which might be related to, logically correspond to, or contradict any of the innumerable series of separate ideas which in their totality constitute the substance of my writings. In my concern to express my thoughts in a form accessible to others, my psychic concentration, time and again, reached such a point that for unusually long periods I forgot even my most essential needs. But the objective injustice most painful to me in all this was that during this inner concentration of the whole of my force for the purpose of transmitting true knowledge to people, both now and in the future, I had frequently to tear myself away from this state, and at the cost of my last reserves of energy accumulated with much difficulty during short intervals between the hours of intensive work, to think out various complicated arrangements for postponing this or that payment, or settling one or another of my debts. During these 6 years, I grew tired to the point of exhaustion, not from writing, rewriting, and again revising the many manuscripts piled in a cellar arranged especially for my archives, but from this periodic necessity to turn over and over in my head all possible combinations for dealing with these ever-increasing debts. Until these last years, whenever I needed the support of others for a material problem, of little importance compared to that for which my time was necessary, support concretely expressed by the word money, and when I did not receive it, I could still be resigned to this as I understood that the significance of my activities could not be clear to everyone. But now that the significance and aim of my activities, thanks to what I have actualized during the last 6 years, may be recognized by all, I do not intend to resign myself to this any longer, but on the contrary, I consider myself justified, with an entirely clear conscience, in requiring that every person who approaches me, without distinction of race, faith, or material or social position, shall protect me as the apple of his eye, in order that my force and time may be spared for the activities corresponding to my individuality. Well then, the aforementioned categorical decision, which was the result of these serious reflections after my secret partner left Child's restaurant, and which I made according to principle, is as follows. While I am here among people who have not undergone the catastrophic consequences of the last great war, and through whom I shall suffer considerable losses, of course without intention on their part, I will once again, by myself alone, without other people taking the initiative, and, of course, without resorting to any means which could one day give rise in me to remorse of conscience, make use of certain capacities formed in me, thanks to correct education in my childhood, to acquire such a sum of money as will clear up all my debts, and in addition enable me to return to the continent of Europe, and live without want for 2 or 3 months. And in doing this I shall experience again the highest satisfaction foreordained by man by our common Father, formulated in ancient times by the Egyptian priest, who was the first teacher of Saint Moses, in the words, "Satisfaction of self arising from the resourceful attainment of one's set aim, in the cognizance of a clear conscience." Today is the 10th of January, 3 days from now, by the old-style calendar. The new year will be welcomed in at midnight, an hour which is memorable for me as the time of my coming into the world. According to a custom established since childhood, I have always begun from that hour to conform my life to a new program, thought out beforehand and invariably based on a definite principle, which is to remember myself as much as possible in everything, and voluntarily to direct my manifestations, and also my reactions to the manifestations of others, in such a way as to attain the aims chosen by me for the coming year. This year, I will set myself the task of concentrating all the capacities present in my individuality toward being able to acquire, by my own means, before my proposed departure from America, about the middle of March, the sum of money needed for clearing up all my debts. Then, on my return to France, I shall begin again to write, but on the sole condition that henceforth I be relieved of all concern about the material conditions necessary for my mode of life, already established on a certain scale. But if, for some reason or other, I fail to accomplish the task I have set myself, then I will be forced to recognize the illusory nature of all the ideas expounded in this narrative, as well as my own extravagant imagination, and, true to my principles, I will have to creep with my tail between my legs, as Mullah Nasruddin would say, into the deepest old galoshes that have ever been worn on sweaty feet. And if this should be the case, I would then categorically decide to do as follows: to give for publication only the manuscripts I have just revised in final form, that is, the first series of my writings, and 2 chapters of the second; to cease writing forever, and on returning home, to light in the middle of the lawn, before my windows, a huge bonfire, and throw on it all the rest of my writings. After which I will begin a new life by using the capacities I possess for the sole purpose of satisfying my personal egoism. A plan is already outlining itself in my madcap brain for my activities in such a life. I picture myself organizing a new institute, with many branches, only this time not for the harmonious development of man, but for instruction in hitherto undiscovered means of self-satisfaction. and there is no doubt that a business like that would run as if on greased wheels.